There's a moment, right before your brain catches up to what your body already knows, where everything gets very still. Not quiet, the mall was always quiet, still. Like the air itself had stopped circulating, like the building was holding its breath. I was standing in the east corridor at 2:47 in the morning, halfway through my patrol, staring at the window of a shoe store that had been closed since before I took the job. The gate was down, the lights behind the glass were off, and standing just behind the display window, half lit by the fluorescent bleed from the corridor, was a mannequin. I'm going to tell you why that mattered. I had walked this corridor 6 hours earlier. I had walked it at midnight. I had walked it at 1:15. That mannequin was not there. I knew every window in that mall the way you know the furniture in your apartment at night. By feel, by shape, by the absence of anything unexpected. That corridor was 40 storefronts of dead glass, and old signage and pulled down gates, and not one of them had a mannequin in the window. But there it was, pale, featureless, positioned just slightly off from where a normal display would go. Not centered in the window, pushed to the side, close to the glass, almost like it had walked there and stopped. I stood in that corridor for maybe 2 minutes. My flashlight was on, but I didn't raise it. I just stood there, listening to the hum of the overhead lights, feeling something in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I didn't investigate. I turned around and walked back to the security desk, and I sat there until my shift ended, and I didn't patrol again that night. That was night 14. But I need to go back to the beginning. I'd been an EMT for 8 years before I ended up at the Galleria del Monte. 8 years on a rig out of Albuquerque, running calls in the middle of the night, learning to sleep with my boots on and eat cold food without tasting it. I was good at the job, not the best, but solid. The kind of guy who could hold pressure on a wound and keep his voice flat while telling someone their husband was going to be okay, even when he probably wasn't. Then there was a call I couldn't come back from. I'm not ready to talk about that yet. Maybe later. What matters is that after that call, I stopped being the guy who could keep his voice flat. I stopped being much of anything. I went through the motions for 3 more months, and then one morning, I sat in the station parking lot and realized I hadn't felt anything in weeks. Not sadness, not exhaustion, nothing. Like someone had opened a valve somewhere inside me and everything had slowly drained out. And all that was left was this hollow ringing, like the inside of a bell after it stops moving. I quit that afternoon, packed what mattered into my truck and drove south until the city thinned out and the desert opened up. And I ended up in Loma Verde, New Mexico. Population 4,000 and change. A town that existed because a highway ran through it, and a few ranches hadn't sold yet. The kind of place where nobody asked you questions because nobody cared enough to ask. I found the listing online. Night security guard, Galleria del Monte Shopping Center. Solo shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No experience required. The pay was bad, but the requirements were exactly what I needed: a pulse and a willingness to be alone in a building for 8 hours. I drove out to see it before I applied. The Galleria del Monte sat about 2 miles outside of town, right where the last strip of development gave way to open mesa. It was bigger than I expected: a 2-story shopping center, built in 1987. Designed during that decade's particular brand of optimism, where someone looked at a patch of New Mexico desert and thought, yes, this is where we should build a luxury mall. It had a glass atrium entrance, sand-colored stucco walls, and a parking lot big enough for 1,000 cars. There were 6 cars in that lot when I pulled in. Inside the mall was maybe a third occupied. A phone repair kiosk, a discount shoe outlet, a vitamin store, a salon that seemed to survive on walk-ins from the highway. Everything else was shuttered metal gates pulled down, signs removed, window displays stripped bare. The main atrium had a decorative fountain in the center, dry, the basin stained with mineral deposits and dust. 2 corridors branched off from it, east and west, lined with storefronts that got progressively more abandoned the farther you walked from the entrance. At the far end of the east corridor was the anchor store, a Dillard's that had closed 3 years earlier. The doors were chained and padlocked. The windows were papered over from the inside. I took the job. They didn't even interview me. The security company, a contractor called Ridgeline Protection Services, sent me a uniform, a flashlight, a ring of keys, and a laminated patrol schedule. Start at 10, walk the full loop every 90 minutes, check all exterior doors, log anything unusual. That was it. My first night, I met Dale Purcell. Dale was the day shift guard, 58 years old, ex-military, built like he'd been strong once, and had settled into a kind of dense, compressed sturdiness. He had a gray mustache and eyes that didn't move much. He was already standing outside the entrance when I pulled up, keys in hand, ready to leave. He walked me through the basics in about 4 minutes. Here's the security desk. Here's the monitors. These 3 doors lock automatically. These 2 you have to check manually. The Dillards stays chained. Don't worry about it. The service tunnels are accessible from a door behind the food court. You don't need to go down there. But the key is the brass one on the ring. He handed me the keys and walked to his truck. I watched him cross the parking lot, and I noticed something that I filed away without thinking about it at the time. Dale didn't look back at the building. Not a glance. Not a casual turn of the head. He walked to his truck with his eyes fixed forward, got in, and drove away, like he was making a point of not looking. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I needed. The mall at night was its own world, sealed, climate-controlled, predictable. The corridors stretched out empty and polished under the fluorescent lights. My boots echoed on the tile in a steady rhythm that became almost meditative. The fountain atrium had a glass ceiling that showed the sky, and on clear nights I'd pause there on my patrol and look up at the stars through the smudged panels. I'd do my rounds, check the doors, sit at the security desk, and read whatever paperback I'd picked up from the gas station in town. The monitors showed 16 camera feeds in grainy green and white corridors. The food court, the parking lot, the atrium. Nothing ever moved on them. The building made its noises, the air system cycling. The tick of lights warming up in different sections, the occasional settling groan of old construction. But those became familiar fast. Background sounds, the voice of the building talking to itself. I learned the mall's geography the way you learn a body of water if you fish it enough. The west corridor had a stretch near the old bath store where the temperature always dropped a few degrees, probably a vent issue. The food court still smelled faintly of grease, even though every counter had been shuttered for over a year. The service tunnel entrance behind the food court had a door that stuck unless you lifted the handle while you turned the key. The east corridor had a motion sensor near the Dillard's entrance that tripped about once a week, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, and always showed nothing on camera when I checked. I mentioned that last part to Dale during a handoff. He shrugged. "Old sensor," he said. "Been doing that for years." His voice was flat when he said it. Not dismissive of flat. The way someone talks about something they've decided not to think about. There were other small things. A ceiling tile in the west corridor that I found slightly displaced one morning, pushed up from below like something had pressed against it, from the crawl space above. I climbed up on a chair and pushed it back. The space above was dark and smelled like dust and something else wet, organic, like animal fur left out in the rain. I told myself it was a raccoon. There were mesa rabbits and coyotes all around the building at night. It made sense that something might have gotten into the ceiling. Then there was the smell in the west corridor itself, separate from the ceiling. It came and went, a thick, musky odor, almost sweet, like damp hide. Some nights, it wasn't there at all. Other nights, it was strong enough to make me breathe through my mouth as I walked that stretch. It always faded by morning. One evening, I stopped at the convenience store in town for coffee before my shift. The clerk, a woman named Donna who lived in Loma Verde, her whole life, asked where I worked. I told her. She made a face, not quite a grimace, more like a reflex, the way someone flinches at a sound they don't like. "You know they built that thing on bad land," she said. I asked what she meant. The Navajo didn't want anything there. The tribe came to the county meetings back in 85, 86, told the developers to pick somewhere else. Wouldn't say exactly why, just said the land wasn't right. Developers didn't listen. Developers never listen out here. She handed me my coffee and moved on to the next customer, and I drove to work and didn't think about it again. Not then, anyway. The mall held its silence around me every night like a cupped hand. And for those first 2 weeks, I told myself that was all it was, silence. Empty space. A building doing what buildings do when nobody's inside them. But buildings don't hold their breath. And by the end of that second week, standing in the east corridor at 2:47 in the morning, staring at a mannequin that I knew for a fact had not been there before. I was starting to understand that the silence in the Galleria del Monte wasn't empty at all. It was patient. I want to be honest about something. After the mannequin, I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. I went home that morning and sat on the edge of my bed and ran through every rational explanation I could find. A store employee left it behind when they cleared out. The cleaning crew moved it. It had always been there, and I just hadn't noticed because the gate was down and the angle was wrong, and I'd never looked closely enough. That last one was the one I settled on. People miss things in familiar environments all the time. I learned that on the rig. You can drive past the same intersection 100 times and never notice the fire hydrant until you need it. The brain edits out what it doesn't consider important. The mannequin was nothing. It had always been there. Except I went back the next night, and the mannequin was gone. I stood at that same window for a long time, pressed my flashlight against the glass, moved it slowly across the empty store. Bare shelves, carpet with sun-bleached rectangles, where display tables used to sit. Nothing, no mannequin, no indication anything had ever stood where I'd seen it standing. I logged it. Possible visual anomaly in East Corridor, Store 14, no action taken. I didn't know what else to write. That same night, during my 1 a.m. patrol, I heard something I'd never heard before in the building. I was passing through the fountain atrium, my footsteps bouncing off the tile and the dead escalators, and the high glass ceiling, and I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, because my body stopped for me that override again. The one where your legs lock and your ears open up and your chest goes tight before the conscious part of your brain has even registered why. It was breathing. Not the air system, not the building settling. Breathing. Slow, deliberate. Wet, the kind of breathing you hear from someone with fluid in their lungs. Someone drowning on dry land. It was coming from inside the walls, not behind them, not from a vent or a pipe. Inside. Like the drywall itself had developed lungs. I stood there. My flashlight was aimed at the wall to my left, about chest height, right between a shuttered candle shop and a store that used to sell luggage. The breathing was coming from right there, from a spot I could have reached out and touched. I didn't touch it. The sound held for maybe 15 seconds. Then it stopped, the way a person's breathing stops when they realize someone is listening. Not a fade, a stop, a decision. I finished my patrol faster than usual that night. Didn't run. You don't run in a place like that, because running is admitting something is wrong. And I wasn't ready to admit that yet, but I walked with purpose. Checked the locks, moved through the corridors without pausing. Got back to the security desk and sat in the glow of 16 monitors showing 16 angles of nothing. It was on my way back through the East Corridor that I found the handprint. It was on the glass of a jewelry store about halfway down the hall. The store had been locked and vacant for 7 months. I knew because the shutdown date was on the paperwork Ridgeline had given me. The metal gate was down, but the glass behind it was visible through the lattice, and there, on the inside of the glass, was a handprint. Not a smudge. A full, deliberate handprint. 5 fingers, splayed wide, pressed flat against the glass from inside the store, at about shoulder height. Like someone had been standing in there in the dark and placed their hand against the window, carefully, the way a child presses their palm against a car window. I crouched down and looked at it through the gate. The print was clear, slightly greasy, the kind of mark skin leaves on cold glass. Fresh. There was no dust on it. Everything else in that store had a layer of fine desert dust on it, visible even through the gate. But the handprint was clean. I checked the lock. Solid. The keyhole showed no scratching, no tampering. I pulled on the gate. It didn't move. I pressed my flashlight to the glass and swept the beam across the interior display cases. Empty velvet trays, a back counter, a doorway to a stockroom. Nothing. No one. No way in that I could see. I wrote it up in the log. Unexplained handprint observed on interior glass surface. Store 22, East Corridor. Store confirmed locked. No signs of entry. The next evening, I arrived for my shift and found Dale at the security desk, reading my log. He didn't say anything about it. He handed me the keys, gave me the same brief rundown, nothing to report. Quiet day, and started toward the door. I watched him go, expecting nothing, already settling into my pre-shift routine. Then he stopped. His hand was on the exit door, and he stopped with his back to me, and he stood like that for a few seconds. I could see his shoulders shift, the way someone does when they're deciding whether or not to say something they've been carrying. "You hear anything weird on your shift?" His voice was casual, too casual, the kind of casual that takes effort. I said, "Maybe." He nodded, didn't turn around. "If you hear something that sounds like somebody calling your name from somewhere they shouldn't be, don't answer it." He paused. "Don't even look." I waited for him to explain. He didn't. He pushed through the door and walked to his truck, same as always, eyes straight ahead, no glance back. I watched his taillights turn onto the access road and disappear, and then I was alone in the building, with his words sitting in my chest like a stone. I thought about it for 4 days, ran it through my head during patrols, sitting at the desk, driving home in the early morning light. Don't answer it. Don't even look. He'd said it like a man who'd learned it the hard way, not like someone repeating a campfire story. There was weight in it, the kind of weight that comes from experience, not superstition. Night 18, Tuesday. I remember it was Tuesday because I'd bought a new paperback at the gas station that day. A crime novel with a bent cover, and I'd set it on the security desk next to my coffee and my flashlight. I was 12 pages in when I heard it. My name. Clear. Not muffled by walls, not distorted by the building's acoustics. Clear and close and spoken in a voice that made everything inside me go cold. My mother's voice. She'd been dead for 6 years. Lung cancer. Diagnosed late, gone in 4 months. I was holding her hand in the hospice room when she went, and one of the last things she ever said to me was my name. Spoken the way she'd always said it, soft on the first syllable, rising slightly on the second, the way she'd called me in from the backyard when dinner was ready. I must have heard her say my name 10,000 times growing up. It was the most familiar sound in my life, and now it was coming from the east corridor at 2:15 in the morning. I didn't move. My hands went flat on the desk. I could feel my heartbeat in my palms, and my wrists and the backs of my knees. The monitors glowed in front of me. 16 feeds, 16 empty spaces. I found the east corridor camera, empty. The fluorescent lights humming over polished tile. Not a shadow out of place, but the voice came again, closer. The same intonation, the same warmth. "Marcus." The way she said it when I was 8 years old and the streetlights had come on and it was time to come inside. Perfect. Not almost right. Perfect. Every instinct in my body wanted to stand up and walk toward that sound. Not out of bravery, out of longing. Out of the part of me that still, 6 years later, hadn't fully accepted that I would never hear that voice again. It pulled at something primal, something below thought, and for a moment my legs tensed and I nearly rose from the chair. Dale's words held me down. Don't answer it. Don't even look. I sat there. I pressed my hands flat on the desk until my fingers ached. I stared at the monitor and I did not look at the corridor entrance to my left, even though the sound was coming from right there, just past the doorway, close enough that if I turned my head, I would see whatever was making it. It called twice more, then it stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. I sat at that desk for the remaining 3 hours of my shift without moving. When the sun came up and I walked to my truck, the parking lot smelled like dust and creosote, and the sky was turning orange at the edges, and I sat behind the wheel and breathed and tried to feel like a person who lived in a world that made sense. That morning, I went home and opened my laptop and searched for the thing I'd been avoiding. I typed it slowly, like the letters themselves might do something. Skinwalker. The results were a mix of Reddit threads, tribal lore summaries, and horror forums. I read for 3 hours. The details varied depending on the source, but certain things kept repeating. Shapeshifters rooted in Navajo tradition. Beings that could take the form of animals, sometimes people. They mimicked voices. They studied their targets. They were drawn to fear, to grief, to weakness, to the cracks in a person where something vital had already leaked out. Most of the sources, the ones that seemed to come from people who actually knew the culture, said the same thing. Don't talk about them. Talking about them draws their attention. Naming them gives them a thread to follow. The less you engage, the less power they have. I closed the laptop. I told myself it was coyotes. Sound travels strangely in the desert, and the mall was a big, hollow structure with ventilation ducts and empty corridors that could funnel noise in unpredictable ways. A coyote outside the building, yipping at the right frequency, filtered through the right combination of ducts and walls, could sound like almost anything. Could sound like a human voice. Could sound like a name. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. But I knew what my mother's voice sounded like. And whatever I had heard in that corridor, it had almost sounded like her. It had sounded exactly like her. And the thing that scared me most, more than the sound itself, more than the impossible accuracy of it, was how badly I had wanted to answer. I went back to work. I want you to understand why, because from the outside it probably sounds insane. But the thing about working a job that scares you is that it doesn't scare you all the time. During the day, in my apartment, with sunlight coming through the blinds and the sounds of traffic and the neighbor's dog barking at nothing, during the day, it all felt small, explainable. The kind of thing you'd tell a friend over a beer and they'd laugh and say you need more sleep. Night shifts play tricks on people. Isolation warps perception. I'd spent 8 years on the rig, and I'd seen sleep deprivation turn solid, rational paramedics into people who swore they heard voices or saw shapes in the dark. It was ordinary, it was chemical, and I needed the paycheck. That was the simple truth underneath everything. My savings were thin, Loma Verde didn't have many options, and Ridgeline Protection Services deposited $480 into my account every Friday. So I went back. Night 22 is when the rationalizing stopped. I was reviewing the security footage from the previous shift. I did this occasionally, not every night, but whenever something tripped one of the motion sensors during my off hours. Most of the time it was nothing. A light flickering, a ceiling vent shifting in the airflow. Once, a bird that had gotten in through a gap in the loading dock and spent 20 minutes bouncing off the walls of the west corridor before finding its way out. This time, the motion sensor in the west corridor had tripped at 3:33 in the morning. I pulled up the timestamp and scrubbed forward. The corridor was empty. Gray tile under the green-white wash of the night vision camera. Storefronts dark behind their gates. The frame was still, nothing moving, and for a moment I thought the sensor had misfired again. Then something stepped into the frame. It came from the left side, from behind the edge of a support column, and it walked into the center of the corridor and stopped. It was shaped like a person. Roughly the right height, roughly the right proportions. But roughly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The limbs were wrong, not dramatically, not like a movie monster with arms dragging on the ground. Wrong in a way that was harder to name. The arms were a few inches too long. The shoulders sat slightly too high, like they'd been attached at the wrong point. And the way it moved at the gate, the rhythm of the steps, looked like something that I'd learned to walk by watching people walk. It had the sequence right. Left foot, right foot, arms swinging in opposition. But there was no weight to it, no natural momentum. Every step was a separate, deliberate action, performed correctly, but without the unconscious fluidity that comes from a lifetime of doing it. It stopped in the center of the corridor, paused, then it turned toward the camera. The face was the part I replayed the most. I watched it 11 times, and I never got used to it. The face wasn't blurred because of the camera quality. The camera was low resolution, sure, but the walls behind the figure were clear enough. The floor was clear. The storefronts were clear. The face itself was what wouldn't resolve. It shifted. Not quickly, not like a glitch, slowly, like something soft that couldn't decide on a shape. Like wet clay being pressed from behind by fingers that kept changing their mind. It held that position facing the camera, face shifting, for exactly 4 seconds. I know because I counted on every replay. Then it stepped out of frame to the right and was gone. The motion sensor didn't trip again. I saved the clip to a USB drive. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took me 3 tries to plug the drive into the port. I sat at the security desk and stared at the frozen image, the last clean frame, before the figure stepped away and I tried to find the rational explanation. Camera artifact, light refraction, a homeless person who'd found a way in. None of them held. I'd checked every entrance, I'd walked that corridor. There was no one in the building. The next evening, I waited for Dale. When he came out for the handoff, I didn't let him do the usual routine. I pulled out my phone, plugged in the USB, and showed him the clip. I didn't say anything. I just held the screen up and let him watch. Dale watched it once. His expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't lean closer, didn't ask me to rewind. He watched it the way someone watches a weather forecast they already knew was bad. Then he handed the phone back and walked to the bench outside the main entrance. A concrete bench bolted to the sidewalk, half covered in blown sand, and he sat down. I sat next to him. The desert wind was warm and steady, pushing red dust across the parking lot in low sheets. The sky was going orange behind the mesa. Dale didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there with his forearms on his knees, staring at the ground. 3 years ago, he said, maybe 3.5. I was doing a walkthrough, late shift before they moved me to days. I was checking the Dillards. Back then they hadn't chained it yet, the doors were just locked. I had a key. He paused. I didn't push him. I went inside. Big open floor, all the racks cleared out. Just carpet and columns and the emergency lights making everything yellow. And she was standing in there, between 2 columns, maybe 40 feet from the door. Who? I asked. My ex-wife, Catherine. We'd been divorced 8 years by then. She lived in Tucson. There was no reason for her to be standing in a closed department store in Loma Verde, New Mexico, at 1 in the morning. But there she was. Same height, same hair, same way she stood with her weight on her left hip. He rubbed his hands together slowly. His knuckles were dry and cracked. She was smiling at me, and that's how I knew it wasn't her, because Catherine's smile, her real smile, pulled a little to the right. It was crooked and it went all the way up to her eyes. This smile was centered, wide, perfectly symmetrical, and it stopped at the mouth. The eyes weren't smiling. The eyes weren't doing anything at all. Dale told me he'd backed out of the store and locked the door. He reported it to Ridgeline as a possible intruder. They sent someone the next day to check. Every entrance was secure, no signs of forced entry, no signs of anyone having been inside. Nothing on the camera footage that Dillard's interior cameras had been deactivated when the store closed. After that, Dale asked to be moved to the day shift. They moved him without questions. You're not the first night guard since me, he said. He said it quietly, like the words cost something. There were 2 others. The first one lasted about 5 months. Quit one day, no notice. Wouldn't even come back to return the uniform. Ridgeline had to mail him a box to send the keys back. He looked at me for the first time since we'd sat down. The second one was a young woman named Rena. She was tough. She'd done private security in Phoenix before this. She lasted 7 months, and on her last night, she came to me during the handoff. She was shaking, and Rena was not someone who shook, and she told me that when she'd gotten home that morning, it was standing outside her apartment building. I felt something cold settle at the base of my spine. What was? I asked, even though I already knew. Her, Dale said. It was wearing her face, standing on the sidewalk across the street from her building, looking up at her window. Same clothes she'd worn the day before, same posture, same everything. She said it was like looking into a mirror, except the mirror was standing in the street at 6 in the morning and smiling at her. Dale stood up from the bench. He brushed the sand off his pants and picked up his thermos. It picks one person, he said, and it stays with them. It watches them. It learns them. He looked at me, and his eyes were the tiredness of a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. It's picked you, Marcus. I'm sorry. I asked him what it was, what it wanted, how to stop it. He shook his head. The more you talk about it, the faster it learns you. I've already said too much. He turned and walked to his truck, and I could tell by the stiffness in his shoulders that he wasn't going to say anything else. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I didn't sleep that day. I drove home, locked my apartment door, closed every curtain, and sat on my kitchen table with the laptop open. I searched for hours. Most of what I found was noise horror fiction, creepypasta, people performing fear for an audience. But buried deep in a forum I'd never heard of, on a thread with 9 replies posted 7 years ago, I found a post from someone whose username was a string of numbers. They claimed to be from Loma Verde. They described the mall, they described the motion sensors, they described the voice. And then they wrote something that I read 3 times and felt each reading settle deeper into me like a nail being driven into wood. It doesn't want to kill you. That's not what it does. It wants to become you. It takes pieces your voice first, then your walk, then the way you hold your shoulders, then the expressions on your face. It studies you the way a painter studies a subject, and when it has enough, when the copy is complete, it replaces you. It steps into your life and it wears everything you were, and nobody notices, because it looks like you, and sounds like you, and moves like you. The original just disappears, and the world keeps going like nothing changed, because as far as the world can tell, nothing did. The post had one reply, someone asking if it was fiction. The original poster never responded. I closed the laptop. I sat in my kitchen and listened to the apartment settle around me, the refrigerator humming, a pipe ticking in the wall, the muffled sound of a television from the unit below. And I tried to convince myself that a 7-year-old forum post from an anonymous user was not evidence of anything. I called in sick that night. And the next night, I spent 2 days in my apartment. During the day, it was fine. Sunlight and ordinary noise made everything feel manageable. I did laundry, I went to the store, I ate meals at normal times and told myself I was overreacting. Sleep deprivation and isolation, and an overactive imagination, fueled by one strange video clip in a spooked old man's stories. That's all it was. Then came the second night. I was lying in bed at around midnight, not sleeping, just lying there in the dark with the ceiling fan clicking above me. The apartment was still. The streetlight outside my window threw a thin bar of orange across the wall, and something tapped on my bedroom window. 3 taps, light, deliberate, spaced evenly, the way a person knocks on a door. I lived on the 3rd floor. I lay there. I did not move. I did not breathe. I stared at the ceiling and I listened, and the tapping came again, same rhythm, same pressure, same window, and then it stopped. I did not look. I remembered Dale's words, and I pressed my head into the pillow and I closed my eyes, and I did not look. In the morning I checked the window from outside. The glass was clean. No marks, no scratches, no cracks. The wall below my window was flat stucco with no ledges, no handholds, no fire escape. Nothing could have reached that window from outside. Nothing with hands, anyway. Nothing that climbed the way things are supposed to climb. I stood in the parking lot looking up at my own window, and for the first time I understood something that rearranged every thought I'd had about this situation. It wasn't just in the mall, it knew where I lived. And the distance between the Galleria del Monte and my apartment, the 2 miles of highway and desert scrub that I had been treating as a boundary, that distance meant nothing to it. It was not contained. It was not limited to the building. The mall wasn't its cage, it was its hunting ground. And I had wandered in and stayed long enough for it to follow me home. I went back on night 26. I need you to understand that going back wasn't bravery. It wasn't even stubbornness. It was the same thing that keeps people in bad situations everywhere. The quiet, grinding math of survival. Rent was due in 6 days. I had $1,100 in my checking account and no other job lined up. Loma Verde didn't exactly have a thriving employment market. And during the day, sitting in my apartment with the sun cutting through the kitchen window, everything that had happened at the mall felt distant and soft-edged, like a dream I was already forgetting the details of. Fear has a half-life. Given enough daylight and enough ordinary noise, even the worst night starts to feel survivable. So I drove out to the Galleria del Monte at 9:45, parked in my usual spot near the entrance, and walked inside. The first 4 hours were quiet. Aggressively quiet. The kind of quiet that felt intentional, like the building was being polite. I did my 10 o'clock walkthrough, checked the locks, sat at the security desk, drank my coffee, read my book, did the midnight walkthrough. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Every gate was down, every door was locked, every corridor was empty and still under the fluorescent lights. At 2 in the morning, I started my 3rd patrol. I walked the west corridor first, then cut through the atrium, then headed into the east corridor and looped back through the food court. It was a route I'd walked dozens of times. I knew the sound of my own footsteps on every surface, the sharp click on the atrium tile, the softer thud on the food court's industrial carpet, the slight squeak near the fountain where the floor had been waxed too many times. I knew the shadows where they fell, how they moved when I passed with my flashlight. I knew this building the way I used to know the inside of the ambulance by memory, by muscle, by the absence of surprise. I came around the corner into the food court and I stopped. Someone was sitting in one of the chairs. The food court had maybe 40 tables, each bolted to the floor with 4 molded plastic chairs around them. The counters were shuttered, the menu boards dark, the whole space lit only by the emergency fixtures that gave everything a thin, yellowish cast. And at a table near the center of the room, in one of those bolted-down chairs, a figure sat perfectly still. It was wearing a security uniform. Not my uniform, not the Ridgeline uniform with the gray shirt and the black pants. An older one, dark navy, different patch on the shoulder, different cut. The uniform of whatever company had the contract before Ridgeline took over. I called out. My voice echoed off the tile and the shuttered counters and came back to me empty. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't turn. I took a step closer, then another. My flashlight beam was steady, even though nothing else about me was. I brought the light up slowly, tracing from the figure's shoes, black boots, standard issue, up the navy pants, up the shirt to the chest, where a name tag was clipped to the breast pocket. The name tag said Marcus Delro. My name, my exact name, printed on a tag for a uniform I had never worn, from a company I had never worked for. I should have run then, I know that. But there is a state beyond fear where the body doesn't flee or fight, it just stares. It tries to process. It stands in the gap between what it's seeing and what it knows to be possible. And it stares because the brain refuses to commit to either reality. I was close enough now to see the body inside the uniform, and it was wrong. The proportions I'd seen on the security footage were there in person, and they were worse up close. The torso was too narrow, the shoulders hitched too high, the arms resting on the table were slightly too long. The fingers, I could see the fingers now were thin and pale and had too many joints. Not extra fingers, the right number of fingers, but each one bent in too many places, like they'd been broken and reset incorrectly, or like they'd been built by something that understood the concept of fingers, but had only ever seen them from a distance. The neck was the worst part. Where the collar of the uniform met the skin, I could see the texture was wrong. It looked like leather that had been stretched over a frame, pulled taut and smooth, but not quite fitting the shape underneath. The shape underneath had too many angles. Whatever was inside that skin did not have the right number of bones. I took a step back. The chair didn't creak, the figure didn't breathe, but its head began to turn. Slowly, mechanically. Not the way a person turns their head with the slight leading motion of the eyes, the natural shift of weight. This was a rotation, smooth and continuous, like a security camera panning on its mount. The head turned toward me and I saw the face beginning to come around, and I did not stay to see it finish. I ran. I don't remember the route I took. I remember the sound of my boots on tile, the way my breathing echoed in the corridor, the slam of the security office door behind me, the click of the lock engaging. I pressed my back against the door and slid down to the floor and sat there with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. After a minute, maybe two, I pulled myself up and looked at the monitors. The food court camera showed the table where the figure had been sitting. The chair was empty. The table was bare. There was nothing there. No figure, no uniform, no name tag. Like it had never existed. I almost let myself believe that. Almost let the relief wash in. And then my eyes moved to the next monitor. The east corridor camera. Something was walking down the east corridor, toward the security office. It was walking the way I walk, my pace, my stride length, the way I drop my right shoulder slightly when I'm tired, a habit I picked up from years of carrying a med bag on that side. It had my walk, not an imitation of it, not an approximation. My walk, the one I'd never seen from the outside, the one I only knew from the inside, from the feeling of it in my legs and hips and spine. And this thing had it exactly. The corridor camera showed it from behind, moving steadily, and I couldn't see the face, and I was grateful for that. I watched it walk until it passed out of the camera's field of view. The next camera, the one covering the hallway outside the security office, never picked it up. It walked toward me, and then it was gone. Or it walked toward me and stopped just outside the range of the lens, in the dead zone between cameras, and it was still there, standing in the hallway, wearing my walk and my name, 3 inches of drywall from where I sat. I didn't leave the security office for the rest of the night. I sat in the chair with my eyes on the monitors, and I didn't blink more than I had to. When the sun came up and I unlocked the door, the hallway was empty. The air was still. The building hummed around me like nothing had happened. I went home, and I didn't sleep. 3 days later, night 29, I pulled into the parking lot, and Dale wasn't there. In 11 years, Dale Purcell had never missed a handoff. Not once. Not for sickness, not for weather, not for anything. This was a man who treated the job with a kind of grim, military consistency, who showed up 15 minutes early and left exactly at shift change and never varied the routine. He was the most predictable person I'd ever met, and that predictability was the only thing about this job that still felt solid. He wasn't there. A note on the security desk, printed on company letterhead, said Dale had called in sick that morning. First time in 11 years. I stood in the empty mall with his keys in one hand and mine in the other, and I felt something shift beneath me. Something foundational, like the floor had tilted 2 degrees, and the whole building was now resting on a different angle. The mall felt different that night. I noticed it immediately, the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm even when the sky is clear. The corridors were the same, the lights were the same. The floor and the gates and the shuttered stores were all exactly where they'd always been. But the quality of the silence had changed. It was heavier, denser. Like the building was full of something I couldn't see. Something that displaced the empty space the way water fills a container pressing against the walls, pushing into every corner, taking up room. I did my midnight patrol because the alternative was sitting at the desk all night, with that silence pressing in around me, and at least moving gave me something to do with the fear. I made it through the atrium and the west corridor without incident. I checked the locks. Everything was sealed. I was heading back toward the food court when I remembered the service tunnel. The entrance was behind the food court, a heavy steel door with a brass key on my ring. Dale had mentioned it on my first night. "You don't need to go down there." I never had. In 29 nights, I'd never opened that door. But Dale was gone now, and the note on the desk felt wrong, and something in me, the same instinct that used to drive me into burning buildings when I was still on the rig, pushed me toward that door. The key stuck in the lock. I had to lift the handle while I turned it, just like Dale had described a lifetime ago. The door swung open on a narrow stairwell, concrete steps, metal railing, a single bulb at the top casting a cone of brown light down into the dark below. The smell hit me immediately. Wet fur, damp earth, something organic and old, like meat left too long in a closed space. I went down, 14 steps. The tunnel at the bottom ran the length of the west corridor, a utility passage, maybe 8 feet wide, with pipes and conduit along the ceiling and bare concrete walls. My flashlight cut a white line through the dark, catching dust motes and old water stains and the occasional maintenance marking in faded spray paint. I found it about 60 feet in. The markings were on the right wall, at about chest height. At first, I thought they were more maintenance marks, the same kind of spray-painted codes I'd seen everywhere else in the tunnel. But when I brought my flashlight closer, I saw they weren't painted. They were scratched, cut into the concrete in thin, precise lines, each one about 1 inch long, grouped in sets of 5. Tally marks. There were hundreds of them. They covered a section of wall roughly 4 feet wide and 2 feet tall, arranged in neat rows, grouped in 5s, row after row after row. Some were old or shallow, partially filled with grime and mineral residue. Some were newer, the concrete still pale and raw, where the surface had been scored. The most recent ones, at the bottom right of the section, looked fresh. Days old maybe, weeks at most. I counted. It took a while. I lost track twice and started over. The total was somewhere around 570. Grouped in 5s, that was 114 sets. If each set represented a week, that was roughly 2 years. But if each tally was a night, a single shift, then 570 tallies was roughly 11 years. 11 years. The exact length of Dale Purcell's employment at the Galleria del Monte. Dale had been coming down here. Every shift, or close to it, he had walked down those 14 steps and scratched another mark into the wall. Not to count the days until retirement. Not to track time in any ordinary sense. He was counting something else. He was keeping a record, a witness mark. Proof that he had been here, that he had made it through another night, that whatever was in this building hadn't taken him yet. Below the tally marks, scratched deeper than the rest, cut into the concrete with enough force to leave rough edges and pale dust in the groove, was a single word. Soon. I stared at that word for a long time. The flashlight began to shake in my hand, and I let it shake. Dale hadn't written that word as a promise to himself. It wasn't a countdown to some future escape. It was a record of something he'd been told. Something he'd heard or seen, or understood in whatever wordless way this thing communicated its intentions. Dale hadn't called in sick. Dale had broken. 11 years of coming to this building. 11 years of walking these corridors with the knowledge of what walked them after he left. 11 years of scratching marks into a tunnel wall like a prisoner counting days, and something had finally cracked. Maybe it was the footage I'd shown him. Maybe it was telling me about Catherine and Rena. Maybe it was just the weight of one more night on a back that had been carrying too many. Whatever it was, Dale was gone, and I was alone with whatever had been patient enough to wait 11 years. I climbed back up the stairs. I locked the service tunnel door. I walked back to the security office and I sat down, and I did not patrol again that night. The monitors glowed in their grid around me. 16 cameras, 16 empty corridors. I watched them the way you watch the surface of dark water, not expecting to see anything, but unable to stop looking. The cameras showed nothing, but the motion logs on the computer told a different story. I pulled them up out of some compulsion I couldn't explain, and there they were, a sequence of sensor activations logged over the last hour. Food court, East Corridor, Junction Hallway. The hallway outside the security office. A path. A straight line from the food court to where I was sitting. Something had walked that path while I was down in the tunnel. Something had followed the exact route I'd taken back, triggering each sensor in order, and the last activation, the one in the hallway right outside my door, was timestamped 11 minutes ago. I looked at the camera feed for that hallway, empty. The motion sensor showed no further activity. But motion sensors detect movement. If something had walked to my door and stopped it, that if it was standing there, perfectly still, on the other side of the wall, the sensor wouldn't trip again. I stared at that door until sunrise. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, I opened my laptop and started typing a resignation email. I addressed it to my supervisor at Ridgeline, a man I'd met once at orientation and never spoken to again. I wrote 2 sentences. I am resigning from my position, effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity. I stared at those sentences for 10 minutes. Then I saved the email as a draft and closed the laptop. I wasn't ready to send it. Not because I wanted to stay. Because sending it meant admitting that everything I'd seen was real. That the handprint, and the breathing, and the footage, and the voice, and the thing in the food court, and the tally marks in the tunnel were all pieces of the same truth. And that truth was something I didn't have a framework for. Sending the email meant stepping off the edge of the irrational world I'd built my life on, and falling into whatever was underneath. So I saved it as a draft. And I drove home in the morning light. And I told myself I'd decide tomorrow. Tomorrow came, and I decided to go back one more time. I want to be clear about something. This wasn't courage. I've never been a courageous person. Courage is what people have when they believe they can make a difference, when they believe the outcome might change because they showed up. I didn't believe that. I went back because I couldn't send the resignation email without going back. And I couldn't explain why, except that there was something unfinished in that building. And it had my name on it, literally. It had my name printed on a tag pinned to a uniform I'd never worn. And leaving without facing that felt like the kind of surrender I wouldn't come back from. Not physically, something worse. The kind of surrender where you spend the rest of your life knowing you walked away from the only question that ever truly mattered to you. And you'll never know the answer because you didn't have the spine to stay in the room with it. Night 30, my last shift. I told myself that on the drive out. Whatever happened tonight, I was done. I would send the email in the morning. I would pack up the apartment. I would drive north or east or anywhere that wasn't Loma Verde, New Mexico. And I would find some other quiet job in some other quiet town, and I would never set foot in a shopping mall again. I pulled into the parking lot at 9:45. The lot was empty. Not even Dale's truck, not even the cleaning crew's van. Just my pickup and 1,000 empty spaces, and the Galleria del Monte rising up against the desert sky like a monument to something that had stopped mattering a long time ago. The wind was blowing hard from the south, carrying red dust and low sheets that scraped across the asphalt and swirled around the light poles. The exterior lights were flickering. Not all of them just enough to make the building's facade shudder between light and shadow, like something breathing. I went inside. The initial walkthrough was normal. Every door locked, every gate down, every corridor empty. I walked the full loop atrium, east corridor, west corridor, food court, back to the desk, and nothing was out of place. But the smell was there. The wet fur smell, the one that usually lingered in patches along the west corridor, was everywhere tonight. It had spread through the entire building like a fog, thick and sweet and animal, mixed with something sharper underneath ozone, the way the air smells before lightning, and something else, something organic and spoiled, like sage that had been left to rot in standing water. I sat at the security desk and watched the monitors and waited. At 11:30, every motion sensor in the building activated at the same time. The alert panel lit up like a switchboard. Every zone, every corridor, every section, all of them tripping simultaneously. The system logging activations so fast, the entry scrolled off the screen. I stood up from the chair. The 16 camera feeds on the monitor wall flickered. Static washed across all of them at once. Not the rolling static of a bad signal, but a hard, flat gray, like every camera had been blinded at the same instant. It lasted 3 seconds, I counted. Then the feeds came back, one by one, and the corridors reappeared on the screens and the motion sensors reset, and the alert panel went quiet. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't the same. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure in your inner ear, the way your body registers the presence of something large and close, even when your eyes tell you the room is empty. The building had changed. Something had arrived, or something that had always been there had stopped hiding, and the air itself felt heavier, charged, saturated with a presence that pressed against my skin like humidity. The mall was no longer empty. I stayed at the desk for 30 minutes, watching the monitors, telling myself that what I'd felt was adrenaline and nothing more. Then I saw movement on camera 6, the fountain atrium. Something was standing in the dry fountain basin. It was hunched, folded in on itself, its limbs drawn up at angles that no human skeleton could produce. Its head was tilted all the way back, face pointed straight up at the glass ceiling, as if it were listening to something above the building, something past the glass and the night sky, something I couldn't hear. It was motionless. Not the stillness of a person holding still, the stillness of something that had no need to move, because it was exactly where it wanted to be. I watched it for 2 minutes. It didn't move, it didn't breathe. It just stood there in the basin, with its broken angle limbs and its upturned face, and it waited. I looked away from camera 6, checked the others. Camera 11, west corridor, empty. Camera 12, west corridor, far end, empty. Camera 3, east corridor. Footsteps, not on the monitor in the building. I could hear them through the security office walls, coming from the east corridor. Footsteps on tile, my footsteps. The exact rhythm, the exact weight, the exact cadence of my walk, but I was sitting in a chair. I was right here, and whatever was making that sound was out there, walking toward me at my own pace, half a second behind the beat, like an echo that had learned to walk on its own. I looked at camera 3. The east corridor was empty. The sound continued. I pulled up the food court camera, and I felt something in my chest come loose, something structural, like a support beam giving way. Every chair in the food court had been moved. All 40 tables, all 160 chairs rearranged. They were arranged in a circle now, a wide ring of chairs facing inward. Every seat pulled out from its table and positioned with geometric precision, not one of them out of alignment. In the center of the circle, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was a figure wearing Dale's face. Dale's face. Not a blur, not a smear, Dale Purcell's face. Clear and recognizable, even through the grainy camera feed. The gray mustache, the deep lines around the mouth, the flat, steady eyes. Except the eyes weren't steady now. They were wide open, wider than eyes should open, and Dale's mouth was moving, forming words, speaking to the empty chairs around him in a conversation I couldn't hear. I stood up from the desk. My legs were shaking. I picked up my keys and walked to the main entrance. It was locked. Not just locked, the deadbolt was engaged from the outside, something that shouldn't have been possible without the exterior key, which was on the facility's manager's ring, not mine. I turned my key. Nothing happened. I pulled on the door. It didn't move. The glass was cold under my hands, and the parking lot was right there, 30 feet away. My truck sitting under the flickering light, and I could not get to it. I tried the east fire exit, chained. A heavy chain looped through the push bar and secured with a padlock I'd never seen before, thick and rusted, like it had been there for years. West fire exit, same chain, same lock, loading dock, sealed. I was locked inside. I walked back to the security office because there was nowhere else to go. I sat down. I looked at the monitors, and for the first time I understood the full shape of what was happening. Every corridor was occupied. The atrium camera still showed the hunched figure in the fountain basin, head tilted skyward. The west corridor cameras showed two figures standing at intervals, evenly spaced, facing the walls with their arms at their sides like soldiers at attention. The food court still showed Dale's face in the center of the circle of chairs, mouth still moving. The east corridor cameras showed three figures. One was standing near the old jewelry store, the one with the handprint. It was facing the glass, one hand raised, pressing against it from the corridor side. The handprint on the inside and the hand on the outside, mirror images. The second figure was near the Dillard's entrance, standing in front of the chain doors, head bowed, completely still. The third figure was in the hallway outside the security office, and this one I recognized immediately, even through the green and white grain of the camera. It was me, same height, same build, same posture. It was wearing my clothes, not the uniform, but the jeans and the flannel shirt I'd worn yesterday, the ones currently folded in the laundry basket on my bedroom floor. It stood in the hallway facing the security office door, and it was perfect. The face was my face. No blur, no shifting. Just me, standing 12 feet from where I sat, separated by a door and a wall and nothing else. The other figures, the ones in the atrium, the corridors, the food court, some wore faces I recognized. My mother's face on one of them, her cheekbones and her thin mouth and her gray hair pulled back the way she always wore it. Dale's face on the one in the food court. A woman's face I'd never seen on one of the corridor figures, young, dark-haired, sharp-featured. Rena. It had to be Rena, and some of them wore my face. Three of the figures, scattered across different cameras, wore my face. But they wore it wrong, slightly off, like a mask that didn't quite sit flush. The proportions were close, but not identical. The expressions were frozen. They were drafts, earlier attempts, versions of me that hadn't been finished yet. The one in the hallway was finished. It moved. On the camera, I watched it take a step forward, then another, walking toward the security office door. Walking with my walk, the one I'd seen on the footage before, the exact gait, the dropped right shoulder. But this time it wasn't just the walk, it was everything. The way I shift my weight when I stop. The way I hold my hands at my sides with the fingers slightly curled. The way I tilt my chin down when I'm thinking. Everything. I looked at the door. I could hear it now. Footsteps in the hallway. My footsteps. Getting closer. And I made a decision that I still don't fully understand. I stood up. I unlocked the door. And I walked out to meet it. The hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. But I kept walking. Down the hallway, into the east corridor. The other figures, the ones in the atrium, the ones along the walls, had gone still. Not just motionless, but still in a way that felt permanent, like they'd been switched off. The mall was silent. No hum from the lights, no air system cycling, no building sounds at all. Just my footsteps on the tile and the thin buzz of the emergency fixtures overhead. I rounded the corner past the jewelry store and stopped. It was standing at the far end of the corridor, 30 feet away, maybe less, under the last functioning fluorescent light, which cast a flat white circle around it, like a spotlight. It was me, not an approximation, not a version, me. My height, my build, my face, my stubble, the small scar above my left eyebrow, from a fall when I was 12, the way my hair sits flat on the right side because I sleep on that side. It was wearing the clothes from my laundry basket, the gray flannel, the dark jeans, the brown boots with the scuffed right toe. It was standing the way I stand when I'm tired, weight shifted to my left leg, shoulders slightly hunched, head level. It looked at me with my eyes, and it opened my mouth, and it spoke in my voice. You couldn't save her. The words hit me like a physical impact. Not because they were loud, they weren't. They were quiet, conversational. The exact volume and tone I use when I'm talking to myself, which I do more than I'd ever admit. The same voice I hear in my own head at 3 in the morning, when the apartment is dark and the ceiling fan is clicking and the memory comes back. The car accident. The call that broke me. A Tuesday night in November 2 years ago. A teenage girl, 16 years old, driving her mother's sedan, lost control on a wet curve and hit a concrete barrier at 50 miles an hour. The front end folded like paper. We arrived in under 4 minutes. I could hear her before I even got out of the rig. Not screaming. Worse than screaming. This high, thin sound like air being let out of something too small. She was conscious, pinned from the waist down. The dashboard had come into the cabin and crushed her legs against the seat. There was blood, but not as much as you'd expect, and I remember thinking that was bad, because it meant the pressure was the only thing keeping her from bleeding out. I had to go in, cut the belt, stabilize the spine, keep her talking until the extraction team got the jaws on the frame. I'd done it a dozen times before. I knew the steps, I knew the sequence. My hands knew the work even when my brain didn't. But I got to the window and I looked at her face, and she looked at me, and she said, "Help me," and I froze. I don't know why. I've turned it over 1,000 times, and I don't know why. Something in her eyes, something in the way her hands were reaching for me through the broken window. Something that hit a wire inside me that I didn't know was there, and everything locked. My hands, my legs, my voice. I stood at that window and I could not move. She died before the extraction team got there, bled out internally. The paramedic who replaced me at the window, a guy named Torres, 4 years less experienced than me, did everything right, but it was too late. She was 16 years old, and her name was Abby Moran, and she died looking at me through a broken window while I stood there like a statue and did nothing. That was the call I couldn't come back from. That was the valve that opened and let everything drain out. That was why I drove south until the cities disappeared and took a job where nothing was alive enough to need saving. I came to the Galleria del Monte because it was a dead building in a dead town, and I could walk its empty corridors at night and never have to look at another human face asking me for help. The thing wearing my face knew all of that. It had taken it from me the way it had taken my walk and my posture and the scar above my eyebrow. It had reached into the part of me that was already hollow, and it had read what was written there. It spoke again. Still my voice, still quiet. "You came here because you wanted to disappear. I can help with that." And I stood in that corridor, 30 feet from my own face, and I understood what it was offering. Not death. Something more complete than death. Erasure. It would take the rest of me the parts it hadn't already copied, and it would step into my life and wear me like a suit. And the Marcus Delro who had frozen at a car window on a November night would simply stop existing. Not die, just stop. The way a sound stops, the way a light goes out. No pain, no memory. No more 3 a.m. ceilings and clicking fans and the high thin sound of a girl who needed help that didn't come. For a long moment, standing in that corridor in the middle of the night in a dead mall in the desert, the offer was the most tempting thing I had ever heard. The hollow space inside me leaned toward it like a plant toward sunlight. The tired, broken, used up part of me that had been running on momentum and coffee, and the refusal to think too hard about anything, that part of me wanted to say yes. Wanted to step forward and let the thing take what was left and be done with it. I stood there for a long time. Long enough for the fluorescent light above the figure to flicker twice. Long enough for the silence to become a physical thing, pressing against my eardrums, filling the space between us like water rising in a sealed room. Then I said, "No." I didn't shout it. I didn't plant my feet and clench my fists and deliver it like a line in a movie. I said it the way you say something to yourself when you've made a decision that costs everything and pays nothing and you know it's right anyway. Quiet, tired, final, one word. A choice to stay inside my own skin even though that skin didn't fit right anymore. A choice to keep being the man who froze, the man who failed, the man who drove into the desert because he couldn't face what he'd done, because even that man, even broken and hollowed and half gone, was mine. My damage, my failure, my life. And I was not going to let something wear it better than I did. The thing tilted its head, my head on my neck at an angle I would never hold. The smile on my face, its face cracked. Not like skin cracking, like a mask. The expression broke along lines that had nothing to do with human musculature, and the face began to slide. Slowly, like wax near a heat source, the features losing their grip on the shape they'd been holding, slipping downward, revealing something underneath. I saw what was under my own face. I will never tell you what it looked like, not because I'm trying to build suspense or leave you wanting more. Because there are things that, once described, lose the very quality that makes them terrible, and there are things that, once described, enter the mind of the listener and do not leave. What I saw was both. It was the worst thing I have ever seen, and it was the most real thing I have ever seen. And I will carry it with me for the rest of my life, and I will not pass it on to you. The figure stood there with its sliding face for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it stopped being there. Not dramatically, not with a flash or a scream or a collapse. It simply stopped being committed to the act of existing in that spot. Like a thought you let go of. Like a breath you release. One moment it was there, and the next moment the corridor was empty, and the fluorescent light was steady, and the tile was bare, and I was alone. I stood still, listened. The mall was quiet, genuinely quiet now. Not the heavy, charged silence of the last few hours, but the ordinary, hollow quiet of an empty building at night. The air pressure normalized. I felt it in my ears, a subtle pop like descending from altitude. The wet fur smell was gone. The ozone was gone. The air smelled like floor wax and recycled climate control and nothing else. I walked to the fountain atrium, empty. The basin was dry and dusty and unoccupied. I walked the west corridor, empty. The figures that had been standing along the walls were gone. I walked to the food court. The chairs were in their original positions, tucked under their tables, exactly as they had been at the start of my shift. No circle, no figure with Dale's face. Nothing. I walked to the main entrance. I turned the key. The deadbolt clicked. The door opened. I walked out into the parking lot. The sky was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, a thin line of gray separating the desert from the dark. The wind had died. The air was cool and still and smelled like dust and creosote. My truck sat under the light pole, right where I'd left it, the only vehicle in a 1,000-space lot. I sat in the cab. I didn't start the engine. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, and I stared at the mall's facade, and I breathed. In and out, slow and steady. The breathing of a man who is still here, still inside his own body, still answering to his own name. After about 20 minutes, I took out my phone. I opened the drafts folder. I found the resignation email. I pressed send. Then I started the engine and drove away from the Galleria del Monte for the last time. I drove north. I didn't plan a route or pick a destination. I just pointed the truck away from Loma Verde and followed the highway until the desert gave way to scrubland, and the scrubland gave way to foothills, and the foothills turned into something that looked like it could hold rain. I stopped in a town called Harlow, Colorado, because I needed gas, and because the woman at the station said the warehouse distribution center on the edge of town was hiring for day shifts. Day shifts. I want you to hear how those 2 words sounded to me, like an open window in a room that had been sealed for months, like the first breath after being held underwater. Day shifts, sunlight and forklifts, and the ordinary noise of people moving boxes from one place to another. I applied that afternoon and started 3 days later. The first few weeks in Harlow were strange in a way I wasn't expecting. Not bad, just disoriented, like stepping off a boat after a long time at sea and feeling the ground sway even though it's solid. I rented a small apartment above a hardware store on the main street. I worked 7 to 3. I ate dinner at normal hours. I went to bed when it was dark and woke up when it was light, and I rediscovered the simple, ordinary rhythm of a life that follows the sun instead of running from it. I slept with every light on for the first 2 weeks. Bathroom light, kitchen light, the lamp on the nightstand, the overhead in the hallway. The apartment glowed like a lighthouse. My electric bill that month was more than my rent, and I didn't care. The light was a wall between me and whatever lived in the dark parts of my memory, and I needed that wall. After about a month, I turned off the hallway light. A week later, the kitchen. By the end of the 2nd month, I was sleeping with just the nightstand lamp, and by the 3rd month, I turned that off too. I lay in the dark and listened to the ordinary sounds of the building, the hardware store's heating system cycling below me, the neighbor's television through the wall, a dog barking somewhere down the street, and I breathed. and nothing called my name and nothing tapped on the window. I tried to check on Dale, called the number he'd given me during one of our early handoffs, back when the job was still just a job. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. I left a message, tried again a week later. Same thing. I called Ridgeline Protection Services and asked about him, and the woman in HR said Dale Purcell had retired effective immediately, and that they weren't authorized to share forwarding information. I did some searching on my own, found a public record that matched Dale Purcell, age 58, previous address in Loma Verde, New Mexico. New address in Fort Collins, Colorado. His daughter lived there, married, 2 kids, a house in a subdivision near the university. I thought about driving up there. Fort Collins was only 3 hours from Harlow. I could knock on the door, see his face, ask him if he was okay, ask him if it stopped, ask him if the tally marks in the tunnel were the only record, or if he carried something else with him, something internal, something scratched into a wall inside his chest that would never smooth over. I didn't go. I think I knew that Dale didn't want to be found, not by me, not by anyone who'd been inside that building. I was a reminder of the thing he'd spent 11 years surviving, and seeing my face would only bring it closer. Some debts you repay by staying away. I looked for Rena too. I didn't have a last name Dale, had never given one. But I searched for every Rena I could find who'd worked security in New Mexico, cross-referencing dates and companies and locations. I found nothing. No LinkedIn profile, no social media, no Ridgeline employment records that I could access. Eventually, I tried broader searches, news articles, missing persons reports, anything with the name Rena connected to Loma Verde or the surrounding counties. Nothing. Her digital presence, whatever it had been, had gone dark roughly 2 years before I ever took the job. I try not to think about what that means. Some nights, I fail. The Galleria del Monte closed permanently about 6 months after I left. I found out from a local news article, a small piece, barely 2 paragraphs, buried in the real estate section of the Loma Verde County paper. The building's owner had terminated all remaining leases and shuttered the property. No reason given. The article mentioned that the site would be fenced off pending a potential demolition review that, as far as I can tell, never happened. The mall is still out there. I checked the satellite images once, late at night, a habit I know I should break. The building sits at the edge of the mesa, surrounded by chain link fence and empty parking lot, the desert slowly reclaiming the edges. Sand drifts against the walls. The glass atrium is dark. Nothing moves in those images, but satellite images only capture a single frozen moment. And whatever lives in that building has always been good at holding still. I've been in Harlow for almost a year now. I have a routine, I have a job. I have a small apartment with a window that faces east, so the sun wakes me up in the morning, which is something I chose on purpose. I'm not healed. I don't know if healed is something I get to be. But I'm here. I'm still inside my own name. Most days, that feels like enough. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself pausing at windows. Not because I see anything outside, the street is always empty. The sky is always dark and ordinary. I pause because of my reflection. It's there in the glass, right where it should be, doing what it should be doing, mirroring me, matching my movements the way reflections are supposed to. Except sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes for just a fraction of a second, my reflection moves a half beat too late. I'll turn my head and the reflection will follow. But there's a delay, tiny, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you dismiss as a trick of the light, or a tired brain, or the natural lag of peripheral vision. But I was an EMT for 8 years. I was trained to notice the things that don't fit. And I notice it. And sometimes, in the silence right before sleep, when the apartment is dark and the building is quiet, and the world is narrowed down to nothing but the sound of my own breathing, I hear my voice, not in my head, from the wall, from just behind the drywall, just past the plaster and the wood and the insulation, close enough to touch if there weren't something solid between us. My voice, saying my name, the way I would say it if I were standing on the other side and trying to get my own attention. I don't answer it. I never answer it, but I hear it. And the thing I can't stop thinking about, the thing that follows me through every ordinary day and every quiet night, in this small town where nothing is wrong and the sun comes up on schedule and my life looks exactly the way a life is supposed to look. The thing I can't escape is a question. I still don't know if it let me go. or if it got what it needed.